The Arizona sun beat down on the silence, a silence made heavier by the screams that had just ended. A woman, Madeline Cartwright, knelt in the dust, her arms a vice around her young son Thomas. Before them stood the man whose warriors had just burned, her home shattered her world, and made her a widow. His name was Taza, chief of the Chiricahua Apache. But as he looked down, not at her, but at the boy, he made a promise. It wasn't a promise of death or torture. It was something far more terrifying, a vow that would steal her son's soul and force her to question everything she believed about justice, savagery, and survival. The land was a liar. It promised life with its vast, achingly blue sky and the distant purple majesty of the Dragoon Mountains, but it delivered death by 1,000 cuts, the scorpion in the boot, the rattler in the shade, the sun that baked the earth into a cracked, merciless plain. Madeline Cartwright had learned this truth in the 2 years since she and her husband John had staked their claim. They had come from Illinois with a wagon full of hope and a shared dream of a life carved from the Arizona territory, a life for themselves and their 8-year-old son Thomas. Their homestead was modest, a single-room adobe cabin that John had built with his own hands, a small corral for their 2 horses, and a stubborn patch of corn that fought the arid soil. It was a lonely existence, but it was theirs. Madeline found beauty in the stark landscape, in the fiery sunsets that painted the clouds in hues of orange and blood, and in the fierce protective love she felt for her family. John was a good man, strong and steady, with hands calloused from work, and a smile that could erase the day's hardships. Thomas was their lighter boy, with his father's determination and her own curious spirit. His pockets always full of strange rocks, and his head full of questions about the world. That morning had started like any other. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dust and sage. John was mending a fence post at the far edge of their property, while Madeline churned butter on the cabin's porch, watching Thomas chase a lizard through the dirt. The silence of the territory was a constant companion, a vast, empty canvas upon which the small sounds of their lives were painted. The shattering of that silence was so sudden, so absolute, that for a moment it didn't register. It was a chorus of high, ululating cries that seemed to erupt from the earth itself. Madeline's head snapped up her heart, seizing in her chest. Over the rise, a line of riders appeared, their painted bodies lean and muscular, their horses moving with a fluid, terrifying grace. Apache. John. The name was a strangled cry torn from her throat. She snatched Thomas, pulling him behind her as she scrambled into the cabin and barred the door. Her hands trembled as she grabbed John's heavy rifle from its wall mount. Through a crack in the shutter, she saw them. They moved with a purpose that chilled her to the bone, their faces grim masks of war. Some set fire to the small barn, the dry wood catching with an explosive whoosh. Others rode toward the fence line toward John. She saw him turn his own rifle coming up. He got one shot off a puff of white smoke against the blue sky. One of the riders tumbled from his horse. But there were too many. They swarmed him, a whirlwind of dust and violence. Madeline stifled a scream, her knuckles white on the stock of the gun she barely knew how to fire. She saw a warrior, taller than the rest, with a streak of white paint across his brow, raise a lance. The world seemed to slow down every detail, agonizingly clear the glint of the sun on the stone tip, the powerful thrust of the man's arm. John's body arching back before collapsing into the dust. The world went silent again, save for the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. Thomas was sobbing into the folds of her dress, his small body shaking. The cabin door splintered under the force of a heavy blow, then another. With a final crack, the wooden bar shattered, and the door flew open. Sunlight streamed in, silhouetting the figures who now filled the doorway. They were not men from her world. They were leaner, harder, their eyes holding a glint of ancient knowledge and profound bitterness. They smelled of sweat leather and smoke. One of them stepped forward and ripped the rifle from her hands, tossing it aside. Another grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and hauled her out into the blinding sun. She was forced to her knees beside her son. The homestead was a scene of ruin. The barn was an inferno. The corral was empty, and the body of her husband lay still and broken near the fence line. A wave of nausea and grief, so profound it stole her breath, washed over her. Then he approached, the leader, the one who had killed John. He was tall, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the surrounding mountains, all sharp angles and deep-set, intelligent eyes. He wore a simple breechcloth and moccasins, his bare chest crisscrossed with old scars. This was a man forged in this unforgiving land, a man who was as much a part of it as the hawk circling overhead. He stopped before them, his shadow falling over Madeline and her son. His gaze was unnerving, not filled with the wild fury she expected, but with a calm, appraising intensity. He looked at her for a long moment, then his eyes moved to Thomas, who had stopped crying and was now staring back, his small face a mask of terror and defiance. The chief's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes, a spark of something other than hate. He knelt, moving with a predator's grace, so he was level with the boy. He said nothing, simply watching him. Madeline tensed, ready to throw herself in front of her son to fight with her bare hands if she had to. The warrior Taza reached out a hand not to harm, but to touch a stray lock of Thomas's sandy brown hair. The boy flinched but did not pull away. Finally Taza spoke. His voice was low and guttural, the Apache words completely alien to her. He spoke to his men, who grunted in reply. One of them grabbed Madeline's arm again, pulling her to her feet. Another lifted Thomas as if he weighed nothing. They were being taken. As she was dragged away from the smoking ruins of her life, Madeline looked back one last time at the still form of her husband, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The dream was dead-burned to ashes and scattered on the merciless Arizona wind. The journey was a blur of fear and exhaustion. Tied by her wrists to the back of a warrior's horse, Madeline stumbled over rocks and through thorny brush, her simple cotton dress tearing her feet, bleeding inside her worn leather shoes. Thomas was seated in front of another rider, his small form held securely. He was silent, his face pale with shock, his eyes wide as he took in the harsh, alien landscape they were being forced through. The Apache moved with incredible speed and efficiency, their ponies navigating the treacherous terrain as if it were a flat prairie. They spoke little, communicating with hand gestures and clipped phrases, their focus entirely on the trail ahead and the sky behind them. After hours under the relentless sun, they arrived at the rancheria, the Apache camp. It was nothing like the orderly towns Madeline knew. Hidden deep within a canyon shielded by towering rock formations, it was a sprawling, seemingly chaotic collection of wickiups, dome-shaped shelters made of branches and hides. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, cooking meat and unwashed bodies. Dogs barked furiously at their arrival, and the people of the camp emerged to stare. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and raw hatred. Women pointed and spat curses in their native tongue. Children, their eyes dark and wary, watched from a distance. Madeline felt 1,000 hostile gazes on her, stripping her bare, judging her. She was the enemy, the symbol of the white invaders who were stealing their land, killing their game, and destroying their way of life. She pulled Thomas closer, as they were untied her body, a fragile shield against the animosity of an entire people. They were shoved toward the center of the camp where Taza stood waiting. He had dismounted and was now speaking with a group of elders. The warrior who had captured them, a man with a cruel slash of a mouth and a single eagle feather in his hair, announced their arrival. Madeline recognized him as Nakai, a name she'd heard Taza say. His eyes burned with a special kind of venom as he looked at her and Thomas. Taza dismissed the others with a gesture and turned his full attention to his captives. He walked a slow circle around them, his gaze as sharp and penetrating as a blade. Madeline met his eyes, refusing to show the terror that was threatening to consume her. She had lost everything. All she had left was a sliver of defiance. Taza stopped in front of Thomas. The boy, exhausted and traumatized, had finally succumbed to his fear and was trembling. Taza crouched down again, just as he had at the homestead. He studied the boy's face, his hands, the sturdy set of his small shoulders. He saw the way Thomas, despite his fear, clenched his fists, a tiny spark of his father's fight, still alive in him. Then Taza stood and addressed the gathered crowd. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight of absolute authority that commanded silence. He spoke for several minutes, his words flowing in the rhythmic, complex cadence of the Apache language. Madeline understood nothing, but she could read the reactions of the crowd. His words were met with murmurs of disbelief, which grew into angry shouts of protest. Nakai, the warrior with the eagle feather, stepped forward, arguing fiercely, his gestures sharp and angry. He pointed at Madeline and Thomas, then at the sky, then toward the east where the white settlements lay. He was demanding their deaths. It was the only thing that made sense. Taza listened patiently, his face impassive. When Nakai finished his tirade, Taza spoke again, just a few sharp words. The authority in his tone was undeniable. Nakai fell silent, his face contorted in a mask of fury and humiliation, and stepped back into the crowd. The chief turned back to Madeline. An older woman was brought forward, one who had clearly spent time among the Mexicans. As she spoke a broken, halting form of Spanish, a language Madeline understood from her proximity to the border. "The Chief Taza, he speaks," the woman translated, her voice raspy. "He says the boy is strong. He has the heart of a fighter. His father died with courage, not like a coward." Madeline stared, her mind struggling to process the words. Courage, they had butchered him. "The Chiricahua have lost many sons." The woman continued, her eyes avoiding Madeline's. "Taza's own son was taken by the white soldier's sickness 2 winters past. He was the age of your boy." A cold dread entirely different from the fear of death began to creep into Madeline's heart. This was something else, something worse. "Taza has made his decision," the translator said, her voice flat. "The woman will work. She will learn our ways, or she will perish. The boy will be Taza's son. He will be raised as Chiricahua. He will learn to hunt, to fight, to be a warrior. His white blood will be washed away by the spirit of our people. He will be called Nantan, Little Chief." The world tilted on its axis. Madeleine stared at Taza, her mouth agape. This wasn't a death sentence. It was a sentence of erasure. He wasn't going to kill her son. He was going to steal him, to mold him into one of them, to make him the son of the man who had murdered his father. "No." Madeline whispered the word barely audible. Then, louder, her voice cracking with hysteria and grief. "No, you can't. He is my son. You killed his father." She took a step toward Taza, her hands clenched into fists. "You murderer! You will not have him!" 2 warriors grabbed her arms, their grips bruising. Taza watched her outburst without a flicker of emotion. He saw not a threat, but a mother animal, protecting her young. And in his world, that was a thing to be respected, even if it was futile. He gave a sharp command. Madeline was dragged away toward a small, isolated wickiup at the edge of the camp. She fought, she screamed, she kicked, but it was useless. As they forced her inside the dark, smoky shelter, she looked back and saw the last, most horrifying image, Taza taking Thomas by the hand, leading her son away toward the center of the camp, away from her, and into a new life. The chieftain's decree had been given. Thomas Cartwright was gone. In his place was Nantan, a child of the enemy. The days bled into one another, each one a lesson in humiliation and survival. Madeline was treated as less than a slave. She was given the most grueling tasks, scraping and tanning animal hides until her hands were raw and bleeding, grinding corn on a heavy stone slab for hours, until her back screamed in protest, hauling heavy buckets of water from the stream under the contemptuous glares of the Apache women. They called her Indache Gohen, the White Woman, a name that was always spat, never spoken. Every night she collapsed onto the rough animal skin bed in her wickiup, her body aching and her heart a hollow cavern of grief. Sleep offered little respite, filled with nightmares of John's death and the ghost of her son's smile. But it was the waking world that was the true torture. She saw Thomas only from a distance. Taza was true to his word. The boy was no longer hers. He lived in Taza's own wickiup among the chief's family. His buckskin clothes were replaced with a simple breechcloth and moccasins. His sandy hair, once neatly combed, was growing long and wild. The Apache language, once a collection of guttural sounds, was now taking shape on his tongue as he played with the other children. Madeline's heart fractured a little more each time she saw him. She watched a ghost at the edge of the camp as Taza began Thomas's education. He wasn't a cruel teacher. In fact, he showed a stern but patient regard for the boy. He taught him how to craft a bow from mulberry wood, how to fletch arrows with hawk feathers. He would take Thomas into the surrounding hills and show him how to read the tracks of deer and coyote, how to identify edible plants, how to move silently through the brush. To Thomas, it was a grand adventure. The trauma of his father's death and his capture was being buried under the thrill of learning these new, exciting skills. He was a boy, and Taza was giving him a world of purpose. He was learning to be strong, to be self-reliant, to be a hunter. The memory of his quiet farmer father was fading, replaced by the powerful, commanding presence of the warrior chief. Madeline fought against it with every fiber of her being. A few times, she managed to get close to him when he was alone gathering firewood or fetching water. "Thomas!" She would hiss her voice, desperate. "Don't forget your father. Don't forget who you are. Your name is Thomas Cartwright." At first he would look at her with confusion, his blue eyes clouded. "My name is Nantan," he replied, once the Apache word sounding strange and yet natural from his lips. "Taza is teaching me to shoot." "Taza murdered your father," she cried, grabbing his small shoulders. "He is not your father, Thomas. John Cartwright was your father, and he loved you." The boy would pull away a flicker of fear and resentment in his eyes. Her desperation was alienating him. She was a reminder of a painful, confusing past he was being taught to discard. To the rest of the tribe, her attempts to speak with him were a source of amusement or irritation. To Nakai, it was proof that the white woman was a poison that needed to be cleansed from their camp. He watched her constantly, his hatred a palpable force. One evening, Madeline saw Taza and Thomas sitting by a fire. The chief was telling a story, his hands moving to illustrate the tale of Coyote the Trickster, the Apache children. Thomas among them were listening with rapt attention. Then Taza began to chant, a low rhythmic melody that spoke of the mountains and the wind. Thomas watched his face, illuminated by the firelight, and slowly, hesitantly, he began to mimic the sounds. That was the moment Madeline's heart truly broke. It wasn't a violent shatter, but a slow, quiet crumbling. She was not just losing her son to a new name or a new language. She was losing him to a new soul. They were teaching him their songs, their stories, their spirit. They were methodically, expertly erasing the son she had raised. She retreated to her wickiup, the sound of the chanting following her. She didn't cry. The tears had long since dried up. Instead, a new feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her grief, a cold, hard resolve. They thought they had broken her. They thought she was just a work animal, a cowed captive. They were wrong. She would learn their ways, not to join them, but to beat them. She would learn to be as hard and resilient as the land itself. She would endure the humiliation, the pain, the loneliness. She would survive. And one day, somehow, she would take back her son. The grief was still there, a constant ache in her chest. But now it had a purpose. It was the fuel for a fire that had not yet been extinguished. More than 100 miles to the east at Fort Bowie, a bastion of Union blue in a sea of red rock and Apache land, the Whispers had found fertile ground. They came from a Mexican trader who had heard them from a Navajo scout, who had them from a half-manned prospector, a white woman, and her son taken by Taza's band after a raid were still alive, living as captives in a hidden rancheria. For most of the soldiers, it was just another tragic tale of the frontier. But for Captain Robert Mitchell, it was an opportunity. Mitchell was a man driven by a singular, all-consuming ambition. He was a veteran of the Civil War, but his service had been in quiet garrisons, far from the glory he craved. He saw the Apache not as a people defending their homeland, but as a pestilence to be eradicated, and their eradication was his surest path to promotion, to a name that would be remembered in Washington. He sat in his sparse office, a map of the territory spread across his desk, the candlelight casting long shadows on his sharp, angular face. He had a reputation for ruthlessness, for believing that the only effective Indian policy was one of absolute, brutal force. The story of the Cartwright woman and her boy was the perfect pretext. A rescue mission. A righteous cause to justify a punitive expedition deep into Chiricahua territory. "It's a fool's errand, Captain," his lieutenant, a weary older man named Evans, had argued. "Taza's people know those mountains better than we know our own parade ground. He'll see us coming a day away and vanish. You'll march the men to death for nothing." "Not for nothing, Lieutenant," Mitchell retorted, his finger tapping the map. "We will be rescuing a helpless woman and her child from the clutches of savages. It's a matter of honor, of duty." Evans knew it was about either. It was about glory. Mitchell wanted Taza's head, and he would sacrifice his entire company to get it. Against Evans' counsel, Mitchell sent out his own scouts, offering rewards for any information on Taza's location. He began drilling his men relentlessly, preparing them for a long, hard campaign in the punishing summer heat. The Whispers had given him a cause, and he would not let it go. Back in the Apache camp, the seasons were turning. The searing heat of summer was beginning to yield to the cooler, crisper days of autumn. Madeline had changed. Her skin was darkened by the sun, her hands calloused and strong. She moved with a new economy of motion, her body hardened by the relentless labor. She had learned to be silent to observe. She understood dozens of Apache words and could follow the gist of a simple conversation. She knew which of the women were cruelest and which might leave a piece of burnt bread for her if no one was looking. Her focus remained laser-sharp Thomas, or Nantan, as he was now universally called. The boy was thriving. He was quick, agile, and fearless. He could shoot a rabbit with a small bow from 20 paces and could follow a trail that was invisible to Madeline's eyes. He was becoming Apache, and a part of her heart swelled with a perverse pride, even as the other part despaired. Nakai's hatred, however, had not softened. It had curdled. He saw Taza's investment in the white boy as a deep insult to their traditions and a sign of weakness in his chief. He believed the boy and his mother were a bad omen, a poison that would bring disaster upon their people. He started to sow dissent among the other warriors, whispering in the dark, questioning Taza's judgment. "The chief softens," he would say to a group of young, impressionable warriors. "He takes the son of our enemy and calls him his own, while the spirits of our own dead sons cry for vengeance. The white eyes will see this as weakness. They will come for us." His words found purchase with a few. Taza was a strong chief, but his decision was unorthodox, and it made some uneasy. One evening, Nakai saw his chance to escalate his campaign. Madeline was returning from the stream, her arms laden with 2 heavy water skins. Her path took her past a steep, rocky embankment. Nakai, hidden in the rocks above, waited until she was directly beneath him. With a grunt, he dislodged a large, heavy boulder. It wasn't meant to be a subtle attack. He wanted her gone, and he wanted it to look like an accident. The rock crashed down the embankment, gathering speed. Madeline heard the scrape of stone on stone and looked up, her eyes widening in terror. She was frozen for a split second, the boulder, a tumbling mass of death, hurtling toward her. But before it could reach her, a figure darted from the side, tackling her with the force of a striking snake. She hit the ground hard. The air knocked from her lungs, just as the boulder smashed into the spot where she had been standing, shattering into a dozen smaller pieces. Her savior was a thin, older woman, one of Taza's 2 wives named Ishkai-Ne. She was a quiet woman who had always ignored Madeline, but had never shown her active cruelty. She helped Madeline to her feet, her dark eyes looking up at the ridge where the rock had come from. She said nothing, but her gaze was hard and knowing. She had seen Nakai lurking there. She looked at Madeline, then at the shattered rock, and spoke a single word in the Apache tongue, "Gont-tse." Danger. It was the first time anyone in the camp had shown her anything but contempt or indifference. It was a warning. Madeline understood then that the camp was not a monolith of hatred. There were factions, alliances, and enemies, and Nakai was not just her enemy. He was a rival to Taza, and he was using her and her son as pawns in his own dangerous game. The whispers on the wind were blowing not just through the U.S. Army forts, but through the heart of the rancheria itself. The incident with the boulder marked a subtle shift in Madeline's existence. While most of the camp still treated her with disdain, Ishkai-Ne's intervention had been a clear public signal. As Taza's wife, her actions carried weight. The overt daily torments lessened. It was a change from hell to purgatory, but for Madeline it was a breath of air in a suffocating room. It also made her realize that her survival and Nakai's ambition were intertwined with the camp's internal politics. She was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol. Taza, upon his return from a scouting mission, was told of the event. His eyes, when he next saw Nakai, were as cold and hard as obsidian. No words were exchanged in public. No punishment was meted out, but a line had been drawn. Taza knew his rival had overstepped, and Nakai knew that he knew. The tension in the camp tightened like a bowstring. To solidify his standing and continue the boy's training, Taza decided it was time for Nantan's first real hunt. This was not a boy's game of shooting rabbits near the camp. It was a journey into the deep wilderness to track deer, a rite of passage for any Apache youth. For Thomas, the news was electrifying. He would ride alongside Taza and the other hunters, a bow made for his size in his hand and a knife at his belt. Madeline watched them prepare to leave a knot of dread in her stomach. This felt like a final severing. He was leaving as Thomas Cartwright, her son, and she feared he would return as Nantan, son of Taza, a hunter of the Chiricahua. Thomas, buzzing with excitement, ran to her just before they rode out. It was the first time he had sought her out in weeks. "Mother, I'm going on the hunt," he said, his eyes shining. He was speaking English, a language he was beginning to use less and less. "Taza says I have the eyes of a hawk. I will bring back meat for the tribe." The word mother was a balm and a sting at the same time. She knelt and gripped his arms, her gaze intense. "Be careful, Thomas, and remember your father. Remember John." The light in his eyes dimmed slightly. A flicker of the old confusion crossed his face. "I will," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He pulled away and ran to his pony, mounting with an agility that startled her. He looked every bit the part of a young Apache. As the hunting party rode out of the canyon, Taza at its head and the small boy riding proudly beside him, Madeline felt a profound sense of loss that was sharper than any physical pain she had endured. The hunt was a formative experience for Thomas. For 3 days, he was immersed in the silent, watchful world of the Apache hunter. He learned to walk without making a sound, to read the meaning of a bent twig or a disturbed stone. He watched as Taza tracked a large buck for hours, a process of patience and deep connection to the land that felt more like a prayer than a pursuit. On the final day, Taza maneuvered the buck into a clearing and gestured for Thomas to take the first shot. The boy's small arrow was not powerful enough to kill the animal, but it struck true, sinking into the deer's flank. The other hunters quickly and efficiently finished the job, but according to their custom, the first blood belonged to Nantan. Taza knelt beside the boy, and with a solemn expression, dipped his finger in the deer's blood and marked Thomas's forehead. It was a ceremonial anointing, a baptism into the world of men. In that moment, surrounded by proud warriors under the approving gaze of the chief, he was beginning to see as a father. The last vestiges of Thomas Cartwright began to recede. While they were gone, Nakai saw another opportunity. With Taza and his most loyal men away, the camp was less secure. His plan was simple and brutal. He would get rid of the white woman, and when Taza returned, he would claim she tried to escape and was killed in the attempt. It would be his word against no one's. He cornered her one afternoon as she was mending a torn hide behind her wickiup, away from the center of the camp. His 2 most loyal cronies stood behind him, blocking any path of escape. "The chief is away, Indachego hen." Nakai sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "There is no one to protect you now. You have brought a curse on this camp. It is time to end it." Madeline scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked around desperately, but no one was in sight. This was it. Her defiance, her will to survive it, was all for nothing. She would die here in the dirt, forgotten. But as Nakai lunged, a voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the air. "Enju!" Stoppish Kaine stood 20 feet away, and she was not alone. Behind her were 3 other women, the matriarchs of their families, their faces set like stone. They were armed not with knives or bows, but with the unshakable authority of their position in the tribe. The women of the Chiricahua held immense power within the domestic sphere of the camp, and an attack on a woman, even a captive one, under their watch was a grave offense. Nakai froze his face, a mask of disbelief and rage. To be challenged by a man was one thing. To be faced down by women was a profound humiliation. He snarled a curse, but he knew he was beaten. To defy Ishkai-Ne and the others would be to alienate a huge portion of the camp and mark himself as a dishonorable man who attacked women. He spat on the ground at Madeline's feet. "This is not over," he hissed, before turning and stalking away his followers, trailing behind him like chastened dogs. Ishkai-Ne walked over to Madeline and helped her up. She looked at Madeline's pale, trembling face and saw not a white woman, but a mother alone, and fighting for her child in a hostile world. It was a reality she understood. "You are Dakal Kligu, the enemy," Ishkai-Ne said softly, in a mix of Apache and the few Spanish words she knew. "But you are also a mother. Nakai has no honor. He hunts the weak." She pressed a small, crudely carved wooden bird into Madeline's hand. "For the boy. My son carved it before the sickness." Madeline stared at the small token tears welling in her eyes for the first time in months. In this brutal, unforgiving world, she had been saved not by a warrior, but by a handful of women. She was still the hunted, but for the first time, she understood she was not entirely alone. The return of the hunting party was a moment of triumph for the camp. The deer was a welcome addition to their winter stores, but the true celebration was for Nantan. The boy with the ceremonial blood still faintly marking his brow was hailed as a new hunter. He walked with a new confidence, his shoulders back, accepting the nods of approval from the warriors. When he saw Madeline, he ran to her and presented her with a strip of jerky. "I helped," he said, beaming with a pride that tore her heart in two. "Taza said I have the spirit of the hunter." She looked at him, her son this stranger, and saw the chasm between them widening into an impassable canyon. She forced a smile, but the words of praise died in her throat. Her silence was a palpable disappointment to him, and he soon drifted away to rejoin the celebration, leaving her standing alone with his offering of meat. The fragile peace, however, was about to be shattered. A few days later, 2 Apache scouts rode into camp at a full gallop, their horses lathered and their faces grim. They had been watching the trail from Fort Bowie and brought terrifying news. Captain Mitchell and a company of cavalry, more than 60 soldiers, were on the move, and they were not on a routine patrol. They were moving slowly, methodically, with pack mules and a clear intent to campaign deep into Apache territory. They were hunting. A wave of panic rippled through the rancheria. This was the moment they all dreaded. The women began to pack quickly, gathering dried meat-water skins and essential tools. Children were quieted, their games forgotten. The men gathered around Taza, their faces hard and ready for war. This was the life of the Chiricahua, a constant state of being hunted. Taza's leadership was absolute. He issued a series of rapid-fire commands. The camp would be struck. They would move deeper into the Dragoon Mountains, into the stronghold of Cochise, a place the soldiers could not easily follow. A small party of the best warriors, led by him, would stay behind to harass and slow the soldiers, to lead them on a false trail, giving the women, children, and elders time to escape. Nakai, his rivalry momentarily forgotten in the face of a common enemy, argued for a direct ambush. "We know the canyons. We can trap them, wipe them all out." "They are too many," Taza countered, his voice calm and steady. "And they hunt for a fight. To face them directly is to walk into their trap. They want to find our families. My duty is to lead our people to safety, not to lead our warriors to a glorious death that leaves our children defenseless." His logic was unassailable, and the other warriors nodded in agreement. Nakai fell silent, outmaneuvered once again by Taza's wisdom. In the midst of the frantic preparations, Taza sought out Madeline. He found her standing by her wickiup, clutching Thomas's hand. The boy looked confused and frightened, the reality of his new life crashing down on him. The glory of the hunt was gone, replaced by the grim business of flight. Taza stood before her, his expression unreadable. "The blue coats come," he said in the Spanish he had learned from years of fighting and trading. "They come because of you." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Madeline felt a chill run down her spine. These were her people coming. A rescue. It was the moment she had prayed for, dreamed of during those first agonizing weeks. But now the reality of it was terrifying. "They will not ask questions." Taza continued, his gaze holding hers. "To them any Apache is a target. The women, the old ones, the children you see here. They will be slaughtered if the soldiers find this camp. This is their way." He was right. She had heard stories of massacres of camps attacked at dawn, of no quarter given. She looked around at the faces of the women, their expressions a mixture of fear and fierce resolve. She saw Ishkai-Ne bundling her few possessions, her face a stoic mask. These women had shown her cruelty, yes, but they were also mothers, daughters, sisters. They were families. The thought of them being cut down by Mitchell's men sent a wave of sickness through her. "You have a choice," Taza said, his voice low. "I will be leading the soldiers away from the main party. It will be dangerous. If you stay with our people, we will protect you and the boy as our own. You will go with the women and children to the stronghold." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Or you can try to reach the soldiers. If you run now to the east, they may find you before we can lead them away. They will call you a survivor and call themselves heroes." He left the choice to her. It was a test, and perhaps a final, calculated gesture of respect. He was giving her back her agency. The choice tore her apart. To go to the soldiers was to be rescued, to return to her world, to have a chance at a normal life again. But it was also a betrayal of the flicker of humanity she had been shown. It would mean leading Mitchell's war party straight to the people she now knew, condemning the very women who had saved her life from Nakai. And what of Thomas? To the soldiers he was a captive boy to be saved. But in his own heart, who was he now? He was Nantan, the hunter. Ripping him away from this life now might break him in a way she could never repair. To stay meant embracing a life she had never wanted, forever bound to the people who had killed her husband. It meant choosing to remain a captive, to raise her son as a Chiricahua warrior, to accept that her old life was well and truly gone forever. The camp was almost empty now. The main party was already moving out, a silent, grim procession into the mountains. Taza and his warriors were preparing their horses for the rearguard action. "Mother, what are we going to do?" Thomas asked, his voice small, his hand gripping hers tightly. She looked down at her son, at his wild hair, his sun-darkened skin, his eyes that held a mixture of two worlds. The unraveling was complete. She was no longer just Madeline Cartwright, the grieving widow. She was no longer just Inda Sego Hen, the captive. She was a mother faced with an impossible choice, and her decision would determine the fate of everyone around her. The air grew still with the heavy silence of imminent violence. Taza and his small band of warriors had already ridden out their dark forms, melting into the twilight landscape, to begin their deadly game of cat and mouse with Captain Mitchell's soldiers. The main group, a somber caravan of the old, the young and the female, was a mile ahead, moving swiftly toward the mountain stronghold. Madeline and Thomas were at the very rear, a position Ishkai-Ne had guided them to, keeping them close. Every snap of a twig, every dislodged pebble sounded like a thunderclap in the tense quiet. Suddenly, a cry echoed from the ridge behind them. Not Apache, but the sharp, clear bugle call of the US cavalry. Taza's diversion had failed, or perhaps Mitchell had simply gotten lucky, his scouts stumbling upon their trail of retreat. Panic erupted. The column of refugees broke, scattering like quail into the rocks and scrub. Ishkay grabbed Madeline's arm, her face grim. "This way, hurry," she urged, pulling them toward a narrow, almost invisible crevice in the canyon wall. Gunshots cracked through the air, the sound sharp and alien in this ancient landscape. Bullets whined overhead, ricocheting off the rocks with angry spangs. The soldiers were coming, and they were coming fast. They crested the ridge, a line of disciplined blue coats on powerful horses, a stark, orderly force of destruction against the chaotic terrain. At their head was Captain Mitchell, his saber drawn and glinting in the dying light. He was shouting orders, his voice filled with a chilling, triumphant rage. Madeline Thomas and Ishkay huddled inside the crevice, along with a few other women and their terrified children. From their hiding spot, they had a horrifying view of the canyon floor. They saw a slow-moving elder, too old to run, cut down from his horse. They saw a teenage girl struck by a stray bullet fall without a sound. This was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Mitchell's rescue was a massacre. The image of John falling in the dust flashed through Madeline's mind, but now it was overlaid with the faces of the people around her. The grief was the same, the brutality was the same. Thomas was shaking, not with the terror of a captive, but with the fear of a child whose home was under attack. "The soldiers are killing everyone," he whispered, his face buried in Madeline's dress. He didn't see them as saviors. He saw them as monsters. In that instant, Madeline's choice was forged in the crucible of gunfire and death. Her world, her people were not behind that line of blue coats. Her world was here, in this dusty crevice, with the woman who had saved her, and the son whose soul hung in the balance. Just as the soldiers began to sweep the base of the canyon wall, getting dangerously close to their hiding place, a volley of arrows hissed from the cliffs above. Taza and his warriors had returned. They had circled back, knowing the main party was exposed, and now they launched a desperate counterattack. It was a heroic, suicidal gesture. The warriors were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Rifles roared in response, and Apache riders tumbled from their ponies. Madeline saw Nakai fighting with a ferocity she had never imagined, taking down 2 soldiers before a rifle ball knocked him from his horse. She saw Taza moving with deadly grace, his face a mask of cold fury as he tried to draw the soldiers' fire away from the hiding places of his people. Mitchell, ecstatic at having finally cornered the band, was not being drawn away. He was directing his men to systematically flush the canyon. "Check every rock, every crevice," he bellowed. "I want Taza, and I want the woman." A young lieutenant and 2 troopers began advancing directly toward their hiding spot. They were moments from being discovered. Ishkay held a knife, her eyes filled with a grim resolve to die fighting. Madeline's mind raced. Running was impossible. Surrender would mean death for Ishkay and a life of confusion for Thomas. She had to do something. She remembered the lessons Taza had taught Thomas, the ones she had watched from afar, the lesson about the loose shale on the high canyon walls. A small disturbance could trigger a much larger slide. Above the soldiers, a steep slope of scree and loose rock loomed precariously balanced. It was a long shot. "Stay here," she whispered to Ishkay, her voice steady with a newfound purpose. Before anyone could stop her, she scrambled out of the crevice and began climbing the opposite wall of the narrow passage, moving with an agility born of desperation. She stayed low, using the rocks and shadows for cover. The soldiers below were focused on the entrance to the crevice, their backs to her. She reached a ledge 20 feet above them. Below her, the field of shale waited. She found a rock the size of her head, hoisted it with a surge of adrenaline, and heaved it into the center of the loose scree. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The initial impact started a cascade, the rumbling sound growing into a deafening roar as tons of rock and gravel broke loose and poured down the canyon wall. It wasn't a massive landslide, but it was more than enough. The three soldiers looked up their faces, a mixture of shock and terror, before the river of stone engulfed them. The rockslide kicked up a massive cloud of dust, temporarily obscuring the entire section of the canyon. The chaos gave Taza and his remaining warriors the opening they needed. They let out a great war cry, and charged not to win, but to rescue. Under the cover of the dust, they swept past the crevice, pulling the hidden women and children onto their horses, and vanished into the labyrinth of the mountains. Taza himself reined in his pony beside the passage where Madeline now stood, her chest heaving. He reached down a hand. "The white woman fights like an Apache," he said, his voice holding no praise, no condemnation, only a deep, profound acknowledgement. She took his hand, and he pulled her up behind him on his horse. As they galloped away, the dust began to settle, revealing a defeated and bewildered Captain Mitchell. He had Taza's camp, but his prize, the chief and the captive woman, had vanished. He had been outmaneuvered not just by an Apache war chief, but by the very woman he had come to save. Weeks later, in the safety of the mountain stronghold, life found a new, quiet rhythm. The losses had been heavy, but the tribe had survived. Madeline was no longer Inda Sigohen. She was now known by a new name, one spoken with a quiet respect: she who makes the mountain fall. She was no longer a captive or a slave. She had earned her place. Her old life was a ghost, a dream from which she had woken. John's memory was a scar on her heart, one that would never fade, but it was no longer an open wound. She had made her choice. She had chosen a future for her son, a life where he would be strong and proud, a leader among his new people. She looked at Thomas at Nantan as he sat with Taza, learning to carve a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. She knew he would never be the man John had envisioned, but he would be a man of honor, raised by the fierce chief who had, in the strangest and most brutal of ways, kept his promise. She was a woman caught between two worlds belonging to neither, but she had saved them both. Madeline Cartwright's story didn't end with a heroic rescue or a return to the world she once knew. Instead, it transformed into a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Forced to choose between a past that was violently erased and a future that was terrifyingly uncertain, she forged a new path. She became a bridge between two cultures, a woman who saw the humanity in her captors and the savagery in her would-be saviors. Her choice to save the people who had taken everything from her was not an act of betrayal, but a profound act of a mother's love, securing her son's survival by embracing the world that had claimed him. If this story of impossible choices and the fierce strength of a mother's heart moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful story, and subscribing for more tales that challenge everything you think you know. What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments below.